Right, so Israel is preparing for a massive ground operation. There are airstrikes that have been going on for the last 7 days now. It's going to be a week since the world saw those very dramatic and brutal pictures of Hamas terrorists targeting Israeli civilians, children, elderly, and of course young people who are at an outdoor festival. But how does this story move forward, both between Israel and Hamas and also in the wider region? Rachel Azaria is former deputy mayor of Jerusalem. Dr. Sarah Yael Hirschhorn is a historian and visiting assistant professor at the Northwestern University. Let me start with you, Rachel Azaria. What is the prevalent thinking in Israel? The national mood in Israel, of course, is that whoever these barbarians are, these Hamas terrorists who did this to innocent Israeli civilians, they have to be accounted for. They need to face justice. But at the same time, what is the game plan here? What is it that Israel is hoping to achieve as an objective, let's say in the next few weeks and in the next few months?
Since the disengagement from the Gaza Strip, Israel left the Gaza Strip, letting the Palestinians an opportunity to live their own life without any of our power over them. And unfortunately, Hamas took over, Hamas that now is much more like ISIS, and they took responsibility, or at least that's what we thought, over the Gaza Strip. And every so often we would have rockets sent into Israel, more and more, and it became more and more intensive. And every time that happens, our civilians that live near the border had to evacuate themselves to other places throughout the country. What Hamas did now, when they started behaving like ISIS, they really don't give us any other option but to attack very seriously and to make sure, and I think this is the objective, to make sure that Hamas cannot be responsible for the Gaza Strip anymore, cannot rule the Gaza Strip anymore, and therefore they won't be able to continue threatening our border time after time after time. What they did now and turned themselves into allies of ISIS, behaving like ISIS, is changing the rules of the games. And at this point, I want to be very thankful to the great nation of India and to your leader, your prime minister, that is very supportive in Israel in these times. This support is very important to us.
All right. I believe we're also joined by Sharon Haskell, who's an Israeli member of parliament. She's joining us, in fact, I believe, from the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament. Sharon Haskell, welcome to the program.
Good evening.
What we are also trying to understand, and I think our previous speaker, Rachel Azaria, just mentioned this, the immediate objective, and I think everyone in Israel and Israel's well-wishers are all aligned with this, that the immediate objective is to ensure the end of Hamas. Hamas is not in a position to rule the Gaza Strip. Hamas is not in a position to carry out attacks against Israel. The more longer-term question, at some point, whenever this military operation concludes, the more longer-term question is, and Israel definitely has a huge interest in the answer to this question, is what replaces Hamas? What comes after Hamas?
So there's one thing that the world needs to understand. Hamas is not a legit government. Hamas is a terrorist organization. What they have done is those sites that we've seen are the things that we've seen that ISIS has been doing all around the Middle East. This is ISIS straight on our borders. Those war crimes and crimes against humanity that they have committed against our people is something that we cannot accept. We have to completely eliminate Hamas in the Gaza Strip. We have to make sure they do not have any more economical assets, military assets, government assets. And then the Palestinian people will be ready maybe for a new leadership. In the West Bank, there's different leadership who can fulfill some of these positions, but that will be their choice of what they do with their future.
Dr. Sarah Yael Hirschhorn, because of this ISIS reference, and the Israeli Defense Forces have put out videos showing these Hamas terrorists carrying ISIS flags, and that, of course, is a very violent, nihilistic ideology. What does it say of our understanding, and this was a collective understanding in the Western world, even in the region there in the Middle East, that ISIS was finished? With the killing of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, it was done. There's no more ISIS in Syria or in Iraq. But this is, as both our previous speakers said, this is not just Hamas. This is Hamas wrapped around with ISIS ideology and ISIS 7th century beliefs. How are you going to counter that?
Well,
I think the challenge for Israel, as well
Dr.
as
Sarah
for many
Yael,
other nations.
That question is to her. Yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry. I think the challenge for Israel, as for many other nations, is that you may be able to decapitate the leadership of these ISIS-like groups, but it'll be very challenging really to kill the idea behind them, which is something that Israel have to consider when installing a kind of caretaker government, when perhaps working with the Palestinian Authority or another foreign nation on Gaza's border to try to maintain calm in the Gaza Strip as Gaza rebuilds and selects a new Palestinian leadership. But as you mentioned, in other countries, in Syria, in Iraq, it was possible to kill the leadership of these movements, but the ISIS idea and the ISIS movement still continues to flourish in some circles, and is, of course, continues to be backed by foreign partners that see an advantage in maintaining these groups and their ideology going forward. So it's very difficult to know how Israel or really any other nation will be able to really finish this idea of once and for all.
Sharon Haskett, I want to come back to the question of a lot of this is predicated on how confined this war is going to be, geographically speaking. If it's contained to a war between Israel and Hamas, that, of course, is something that the world can live with. But if Hezbollah gets involved in it, and if Iran gets involved in it, and there are fighters coming in from Syria, and who knows what Egypt is going to do, if this spills over into a wider regional conflict, that, of course, is a concern not just for Israel, it's a concern for the wider world. How much of that conversation is happening in Israel right now? I know that Antony Blinken was there. President Biden, in his press conference a couple of days ago, said we're moving the aircraft carrier so that Iran gets a message, don't get involved. But the contingency, if these other players get involved directly in this conflict, that A, it will drag on for far longer than whatever the operational timelines are right now, and B, it could be far more deadly, both in terms of loss of human lives and far more costlier. We're already seeing one war between Russia and Ukraine, which has been going on for the better part of the last 18 months.
I will take that if Sharon
Sharon is answering, but I think she's on mute. I think you have to unmute Sharon Haskell.
Am I on mute?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Now we can hear you. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So we are already in a multi-front war. I mean, Hamas is not. You need to understand. Whoever behind this attack is, it's not just Hamas. This is Iran. Iran with troops on the ground. You can hear in some of those social media videos that were published, people speaking in Farsi. It means that Iran have troops on the ground. They have funded it. They have planned it with Hamas. The head of the snake is Iran. Iran is the biggest instigator of terror around the Middle East, and they're not afraid to use their proxies. So Hamas is one of their proxies. Hezbollah is another proxy. They have proxies in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen. And right now, just in the last 3 days, they have already sent cells of terror through our northern border in order to attack Israel. There were mortars shot towards Israeli towns from Syria and from Lebanon as well. So this is already escalating, and the person who's responsible for it is Iran. So we understand that the equation all around us, to be honest, in the Middle East has to change to bring safety and security. I mean, Israel is just one of their enemy, but don't forget, just a few months ago, they actually shot rockets and into a civilian airport in Arabia Saudi. They're instigating terror and war all around the Middle East, and we have to fight it together. This is a mutual enemy that all of us are sharing. And in order to bring peace and stability, we have to cut the head of the snake. This is already clear to so many leaders around the world. It's not just a fight between...
But Rachel Azaria, what may that mean? Because a full-fledged war, if it came down to that, between Israel and Iran on the one side, Hezbollah on the other, and of course with Hamas on the western side and the southern side, what may that mean? I mean, A, is the world ready for such a war? And B, Is that a war whose consequences, whose fallout, both in terms of human costs as well as military costs, is that something that the world is prepared for? That the world can handle that kind of a three-front war, if you will?
First of all, I want to say I don't think the world was ready or prepared, or we were prepared, or anyone, for the sights that we saw of the attack of the ISIS form of Hamas in our southern border. This is something new. The game is changing in so many ways. And we realize that we have no other choice but to protect our families, protect our children, protect our parents. And we know that Hezbollah and Hamas, or the ISIS form of Hamas, they're allies. And we see what Hezbollah is already threatening, and Syria and Iran, they're working together. We have to figure out, and that's what our government is doing, how to make sure that we end this war with as safe borders as possible. We're not interested in a huge war. What we're interested in making sure that our children and our parents can be safe. This is not something we expected. This is not a war. It's not the kind of wars that we've been having in Israel over the past 20 or 30 or 50 years. Mm-hmm. This is more similar to the wars our parents were a part of. We didn't think we'd have to do this, but if we have to do this, we will do it. We have no other place to go. This is our country. And when you push people towards the wall, when they don't have any other possibility, we will take any measures that we need to do to make sure that we can live safely with no form of ISIS around us. We're willing to take very serious measures to live peacefully with our neighbors. We did it in Egypt. We did it in Jordan. We worked very hard with the Palestinian Authority, and we have very good relationships with them. But anyone that comes to attack us with missiles, with ISIS forms of attacks, they need to know that we'll be here and we will stand up for our rights. We can't afford to have these kind of attacks in our borders. No one can. No country is supposed to live that way. No child in the world is supposed to live that way. And we have army, and we have many reserve units and fathers that are leaving their homes now to join the army to make sure that this will not happen again. This is our responsibility.
All right, Dr. Sarah Yael Hirshhorn, I'll give you the final word. I think what the previous speaker mentioned, and I think there's a qualitative difference in the provocation that happened on Saturday and subsequently now in Israel's response, is that in the many attacks and counterattacks, at least in the last 20, 25 years that we've seen between Hamas and Israel, I can't recall an instance where civilians were targeted in such a large scale, elderly, babies who have nothing to do with this conflict. By and large, the targets of such attacks in the past have been government employees, soldiers, passing military convoys, etc. And yes, civilians have been collateral damage. In this attack, civilians were the target. And that, I think, is not something that any state, any civilized state would brook.
I think you're absolutely right. I think this is why you see many Western governments supporting Israel and saying that Israel needs to do whatever is necessary to defend herself, because this is really a global war against terror, a global war of Western societies that believe in democracy and defending their civilians and conducting war by certain rules of engagement that don't involve brutal atrocities against civilians living in southern border communities, minding their own business on an early Saturday morning and finding themselves, essentially butchered in their beds. For those reasons, I think the Western world will stand strongly with Israel, but it will remains to be seen how Western opinion may shift if Israel indeed intends to reoccupy the Gaza Strip over the longer term and not just in the coming weeks to stabilize the situation and perhaps be able to extract the captives, the hostages who were taken into Gaza, but is planning a much more long-term engagement there. And I think Israel needs to think carefully about how its alliances with the West may change should these kinds of policies be pursued. The West is certainly behind Israel right now, has seen the most brutal images of Jewish death since the Holocaust, but the coming weeks and months may indeed be times, difficult times, as Israel tries to move forward.
All right, Dr. Sarah Yael Hirshhorn, Rachel Azaria, and Sharon Haskell, thank you very much for joining us.